I wanted to start off this series with a painting that I quite value in terms of its explicit mapping of the human subject in modernity. Now, I had a series on my old WordPress blog you can find in my link tree in the description called Monday Modern Art Madness, where I would take one painting a week and sort of analyze it. But I think that that series is good for video format. This is a mixed media painting by George Grosz made around 1919 after the First World War, and it depicts quote unquote Citizen Dunderhead, one of the Dadaist mischief makers featured in a MoMA exhibit currently. What you have is the sort of Dadaist experimentation between collage and painting proper, and a breaking free of the resources that artists were limited to. You have various cutouts from advertisements, from newspaper flyers, and so forth, depicting common objects affecting the subject, this very dour looking man who is immersed in the mechanical operations of the modern world, also the growing consumerism of the modern world. Because Grosz depicts various states of madness and the subject compelled towards certain forms of madness. So here you have a advertisement for bread, for a door handle forming a question mark upon his head. You have his mouth and his eyes being pure cutouts, some form of a instrument for measurement. You have a razor blade fixed to his neck, and you have various other implements that indicate that the subject is now submerged in the dialectic of both consumer capitalism, the mechanization of life, and the state of the subject in modernity proper, being subject to these forces of mechanization, what Heidegger would call enframing. The human face itself is transformed because Grosz, in his various other paintings, also transformed the human face and affixed to it the madness that was produced by society in decay, by the forces of war. I mean, he did oppose the regime that would come after the Weimar Republic period, but he has a number of reasons for this. He follows along the tradition of Dadaism. This was before he got into expressionism proper. So, for example, the Hussman collage statue, mechanical head, spirit of our age, it's very evocative of it, of taking mixed media elements and creating the sort of mannequin head out of various implements of consumer production, of mechanization, and so forth. Grosz directly ties this later on to the growing remilitarization of Germany as saying that, like the military, like life within an apparatus of military power, the subject itself is also mechanized and also instrumentalized towards the ends of maximum social and political and economic efficiency. So it's very interesting how he chose collage elements, because as these goods sort of affect the subject in certain ways, as our relation to production is expressed, now you have literally upon the human body and the human face a sort of grafting on of what we consume and what we see in terms of media. And it's very curious because this is quite a stark message. As the razor blade is affixed to his neck, he is in a precarious position. He has no agency. He is the common mass individual. And this is why I think the Grosz collage is such a powerful and striking image. We shall cover George Grosz in other installments of Modern Art Madness. Of course, Grosz was drafted for the First World War, but around 1917, he was discharged as being quote-unquote permanently unfit. Before the rise of the other regime in the 1930s, he promptly left Berlin. And what's interesting here is, of course, from his communist, albeit bourgeois perspective, we have the modern subject being subject to a form of madness in the mechanization of the subject rather than the typical madness that Grosz would usually depict of an intense, primal, gratuitously sexual, and avarice variety. Here, the subject no longer has the agency to respond to the collapse of social norms and signifiers. Rather, it is much more of a demure position where the subject is grafted various implements and the subject becomes one with a form of production. So it very much is, around this time, he was a member of the Communist Party in Germany. He very much is depicting modern dehumanization of the subject within urban life. And this relation of the subject to production is quite interesting. The one thing I would note is a sort of cautious warning for those who wish to appropriate much of Expressionism, and even I'm in some sense warning myself, trying to use them for the purposes of a starkly anti-modern message is complicated because of the various, let's call them dandyist, ultra-communist, anti-nationalistic sentiments that Grosz and others of his ilk and his movement were expressing. For example, he says, it is true I oppose the war. That is to say, I'm opposed to any system that coerces me from an aesthetic point of view. On the other hand, I rejoice over every German who dies a hero's death on the field of honor. To be a German means inevitably to be cruel, stupid, ugly, fat, and inflexible. It means to be unable to climb up a ladder at 40. Ironically enough, in the end of his life, he ended up actually dying from an incident where he fell off of a ladder. To be badly dressed, to be a German means to be reactionary of the worst kind. It means only one among 100 will occasionally wash all over. So here we have very much the sentiment of decadent sort of individualism that would find popularity in Weimar Germany, that was then later quashed by the regime that came afterwards. He found some sort of peevish joy in the fact that a number of his paintings were called degenerate art, and that he was lambasted as having a total and callous disregard for the body. So I think that there is a lot of interesting content when it comes to the German Expressionists and the Dadaists, but overall we have to realize the social milieu that they're coming from. And even though it presents a very interesting critique of the modern world as being a force of the instrumentalization of the body, he's coming at it from such a way as to sort of disregard the other trains of thinking, the sort of what he would term reactionary trains of thinking that would also oppose this mechanization of being. So Grosz is a very interesting artist at this time, as all of the German Expressionists are, but keep in mind the purpose of what he's doing. And at the end of this article, it says that now we put them away in museums as baubles of artistic interest and mere aesthetic interest, and we neglect the original movement and the sort of agitation propaganda these art movements were doing at the time, especially Dadaism and German Expressionism, although German Expressionism took a different turn than the sort of Dadaist upending of all social, political, cultural expectations. And Grosz then later goes into more of an expressionistic territory. So this has been the first installment of Monday Modern Art Madness. Please go to Patreon for a extra episode that will also premiere every Monday. And subscribe, like, share. God bless. Goodbye.